Hey everyone, my name is Alex and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to kick off a series where we build a small app together and start diving into concepts involved with Shopify app development. The app we'll be going through in this series is a product updater that lets us quickly update things like the title, description, and variant information of products in our store. Like I mentioned, this is a small app and it's not meant to be a full-blown starter that you can take and modify and submit to the App Store. But instead, it'll be an app that's small enough so we can understand the basics of the tools you'll be working with and not be overwhelmed by the size of the codebase. And I just want to point out that the example app guide on shopify.dev is a really great walkthrough and sample app to build as well, and a much more real-world example. But I've heard quite a few people say that it's too complex with too much stuff going on to really understand all the concepts when you're starting out. So for this app, we're going to the opposite side of the spectrum and keeping it very simple and focusing on the basics. We will still be hitting important topics such as server routing, REST and GraphQL API fetching, navigation through the admin, and using Polaris to build the UI. I'm not really going to spend much time on the actual code and logic parts of this since you should be up to speed on JavaScript and React development, so then we can focus on the Shopify specific parts here. We'll especially be spending time on the Polaris and AppBridge components since that makes up for almost the entirety of the front end. So go ahead and pull up your editor so you can follow along, and let's get started. All right, so here we have the project pulled up in the code editor. If you don't have a project created already, then go check out my last video. I'll put a card on the screen so you can click on that and go through the whole setup and then come back to this one. Or if you just go through the getting started guide on Shopify, it'll walk you through the creation of a project from the CLI, and we'll be looking at the same template. So go do one of those first, get your project set up, and then come back to this video. In this part one of the series, we're going to go over the app structure, take a look through the folders and see how everything is set up. I did mention we're going to go through server routing and all that. Right now, we're going to kind of just go through the files and get a high level picture of what's going on. And then when we get to the server routing and auth and billing and all that in the next videos, that's when we'll kind of do a deep dive there. So we're going to start here at the top level and just kind of go through and drill down into the project and see what we can find. So starting out at the top level here, there are a lot of files that we kind of don't need to worry too much about. A couple markdown files. The README file I do recommend going through. There's a lot of content about just kind of more information about the project and template and how it was set up. You can see the tech stack they're using here. They're using Express on the server, Vite to build the front end, React Router, React Query, a couple other third-party tools. So yeah, I highly recommend going through this just to kind of get an idea of the tooling. We will be going over it obviously in the series, but it's good to read through it and kind of get the high level picture from this one file too. Then you got package JSON, Docker file, git ignore, Docker ignore. These are all kind of standard files that come with any project. The node modules folder, of course. And then the Shopify app toml file is a configuration file for Shopify. You can see they have the scopes in here for the API scopes. You don't really have to worry too much about editing these and changing things around if you don't want to customize the build process. So if you leave it as is, then it'll work for the majority of people. But if you want to have more control over how things are built, then these are available for you to kind of make more edits and more configurations. So the web folder here is the one that is most important because it holds the application code for the server and the front end and just everything in between. And you can see there's another toml file in this web folder that has a couple other configs specific to Shopify. So again, you can leave this, not worry too much about it unless you want to customize deeper. More packaged JSON files. The index.js under this web folder is where the main server file lives. So the main entry point for your application. So you probably will be spending a lot of time in here. This is where the project is, initialized. This is where the server is created and started. And obviously you have your endpoints in here. All the middleware that's used, the Shopify auth middleware, the billing middleware. There's pretty much everything that the app needs in order to work is housed here in this file. So this is an important one that we'll be going through in depth in the later videos. But today we're just going to kind of point out a few important parts as we, again, get this high-level overview of everything. The other files and folders under this web folder these are all pretty much imported into this index file, so they're all helper files and helper functions. This file's for setting up the GDPR webhooks, which are some mandatory webhooks that your app needs to subscribe to. A couple other helper folder files in here. You've got your middleware folder, which has your auth, and then a middleware that verifies the request that it's an authorized request coming through, and a couple other helpers. So this, and then of course you have the front end folder, which is all, as it sounds, it's just all the front end code. So let's come back to the server file though for a minute and kind of take a quick peek through this. If you've worked with Express before, then this should look pretty familiar to you. There are some Shopify specific things in here, like for example, these things being imported from the Shopify API. You get a Shopify object, and the first place you'll notice that being used is right here where it's initializing the context. And this basically sets the stage for the API to be able to work, and you get a lot of helper functions with this Shopify object. For example, to register the webhooks. If you come down here a bit, you'll see something like this. Shopify utils load current session is pretty common, and these all use this context. Like you can see, you're putting in your API key, the secret, the scopes, the session storage. So this is everything that the API needs in order to do its thing. And something kind of cool with the CLI is when you run the command, the npm run dev from the main folder, then it actually gets all of this information. It builds the environment variables that you need, because you can see there's no .env files in here anywhere. So it is it's getting the information from your application and building it and taking care of everything behind the scenes. And that could be, a good thing, a bad thing. If you want more customization, more control, more granular control over how everything works, then, obviously that it could be a bad thing. But for most people, I think this will work great, and it's a great flow and a great setup. Scrolling down here a bit, you can see that we're also registering webhooks through the Shopify object. And in this example, they're registering for the app uninstalled webhook, which is pretty self-explanatory. But basically, if you are registered to this, then when an app or when a shop uninstalls your app, then it fires off this webhook, and it basically runs your webhook handler here. So here's where, if you have, if you need to go into the database when a shop uninstalls your app and mark them as uninstalled or set an uninstall date or anything like that, then this is where you can take care of that and also delete them from your active sessions. They've also got a billing settings object here. It's set to required false by default. So we're going to leave that like that for now, but later we'll go over how to set that up. It's basically just a helper object that they've put in here. So you can put in all the billing setup properties like the charge name, amount, the currency code, whether it's a one-time charge or recurring or usage-based charges. So this is just a helper object that they kind of put in here for us. And below that, we've got the setup GDPR webhooks function. There are a few webhooks that are mandatory that your app needs to subscribe to or register, and you need to handle appropriately when they're fired off. You can kind of get more info about that from these links here. But these are the mandatory webhooks that you need to register. And we'll be taking a closer look at that a bit later. All right, and then we get into the create server function, which, as the name implies, is where we actually are creating the server and getting things set up, setting up the middleware, the API routes, and so on and so forth. And as we go through this server function here, you can see that the use online tokens variable is the first thing that we run into. There are two types of tokens, online and offline. Online tokens are short-lived, and they're tied to a user's permission levels. Offline tokens are long-lived. They don't expire until a shop uninstalls your app, and they are better suited for background tasks or things that don't directly require user interaction. So we'll keep this, right now it's set to false. So for offline tokens, and we'll just keep it that way for now. As you come down a little further, you can see this is where the auth routes are being set up, and they are extremely important. They're very important to understand what's going on here, because there are a lot of issues that can arise if they're not set up correctly. And even just debugging, it'll help to get a really good understanding of what's going on here. This is something we'll be going over in a later video when we are setting up our server endpoints, but just something to be aware of. And under that, we've got the route set up to handle the webhooks. Up above where we were registering this app uninstalled webhook, and then we have the webhook handler. Whenever we receive one of those webhooks, it hits this route, and then the webhook is processed and returns a response to Shopify. And this process function basically just goes through and calls this webhook handler for whichever webhook was received. Then we've got the verify request middleware being used, and you can see this is applied to all the API routes. And in the comment just above, it says all endpoints after this point will require an active session. So if you try to hit the API from your front end, then it's going to make sure that it hits this verify request middleware first and make sure that the session is active, that everything checks out. And if it does, then it'll continue on and let you hit one of these, whatever endpoint you were trying to hit. And I just want to stress one more time that I know we're kind of just glazing over these right now, but they're extremely important to understand, and we will be going deeper into them in a later video when we set up the endpoints for our app, and we'll make sure to take some time to go through the auth routes and this verify request middleware and really understand what's going on under the hood. Because you most likely will run into problems, and understanding exactly what's going on here will be immensely helpful later on. So after this verify request middleware, you can see that there are a couple endpoints here that are being used by the default template app, specifically one to get the count of the products, and then another endpoint to create products. And these are actually using two different APIs. This one is using the REST API to get the product count, and this one is using the GraphQL API to create products. It's using this helper function here, product creator, but if we go into it, you can see it's using the GraphQL client. So, which we'll also get into using the REST versus GraphQL, but it's totally possible and totally fine to use both of them. Although going forward, the GraphQL will be getting more features and different endpoints that the REST API will not have. So it is important to recognize that there are differences and probably favor the GraphQL API going forward for any new projects that you're starting. After these endpoints, you have the express.json middleware being applied. And this gives you access to the request.body attribute. So if you're making a post request and you've got a payload, then you're going to want to put it after this so you have access to the payload in the body. Then we've got a middleware here that is checking if your app's embedded. And if it is, then it's setting a couple special headers needed because it opens in an iframe. Then you've got a conditional here. It's checking if it's prod. It just serves from different locations depending on if you're in the prod environment or the dev environment. Then at the bottom of the file, you've got the final piece of middleware that's applied to all routes. And it's kind of the gatekeeper for the rest of the server. It's checking if the shop is present in the request. Runs a couple other checks, make sure the app's installed. If it's not installed, then it redirects you through the auth flow. And then if everything checks out, then it redirects you to the app successfully. So that was an overview of this server file. There are some other files here that we really didn't get into, but that we will be diving into and modifying and adding and taking away things in the next videos. So we'll get a much better understanding of how everything works later on. And now we're ready to move on to the front end folder, which again is just nested under this web folder. And if you go into index.jsx, then this is where the React app is initially rendered. I'm assuming, again, that you're familiar with React. And it's just rendering the app basically on this div. So if we go into this app.jsx, there's a couple important things that we'll find here. You can see there are a few providers here, like the Polaris provider, which gives you access to the Polaris components, the browser router for routing, app bridge, which is an important piece. This template kind of abstracts a lot of it away, so you don't really need to do much config for app bridge, but it's basically what allows your app to be loaded into the iframe and still kind of interface with the rest of the admin. So there's a lot of things going on there that I do want to go over in a later video. But for this template and for the app, it's kind of, the complexity is kind of abstracted away. You then have the query provider, which is using React Query under the hood, and then the navigation menu, which is an important part. And we'll go through the routes real quick and how that all works. So you can see there is a navigation links prop on this navigation menu. This one is just set to page name. And then if you open up this routes component, which we don't really need to spend time in here, but basically all it's doing is it's finding all of the pages under this pages folder and turning them into routes. So it's file-based routing. So if we come back into this app.jsx, you can see the navigation links. We saw that page name and the destination is /page name. And all that is doing is adding a navigation item on the left-hand side of the admin. And this particular link is going to this pagename.jsx component. So with file-based routing and with how this is set up, it's pretty easy to add new routes. So if I wanted to add a new route, just it's called test for now, and then set the destination to this not found component. Now, when we load up the app, if I were to click on this test navigation link, it would route me to this not found component. And we'll see that in action in a little bit. But it's pretty neat, very simple and straightforward. And the navigation menu on the left is pretty nice to have as well. And just to note that these providers are actually found under the components folder, under the providers folder. And like I said, a lot of this is abstracted away, so you don't really need to do anything for these. But that's where those are stored. And moving on from there, let's just go right into this index.jsx file under pages. This is the home page of the app. If you kind of follow how this is all working, obviously there's the routes, the navigation links, and the index file under pages is going to be the default page when you just navigate to the app home. This is what will show. You can see here that this whole page is made up of Polaris components, which gives the app a very familiar feel to the rest of the Shopify ecosystem. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack here that we'll be going over, but Polaris is really neat. I've really enjoyed using it. Very easy to get a good looking UI up quickly. And once you kind of understand how everything fits together and you understand which components to use where, then you can get an app up and running really quickly. You can see there are a few more pages under this pages directory. The page name component, which we mentioned earlier, it's just kind of a boilerplate code in here. Not found component, pretty self-explanatory. It's shown when the page isn't found. Exit iframe.jsx is used by the server when there's a client-side redirect. So again, for this, you don't really need to do anything. It's just there to be used by Shopify, but you don't need to edit it or change anything with it. If you scroll down to the bottom of this index.jsx file, then you'll see it's using the products card component. And this is the card that shows on the default app that allows you to populate products. And you can see it's all Polaris as well. We'll be modifying a lot of this, but it's important to note that there are a couple important hooks that it's using here. This use authenticated fetch hook is important, and you're going to be using it throughout your app. It basically just makes everything easier so that if you need to query an endpoint on your backend, say you need to, well, like for example, how they're using it here, if you need to hit the endpoint to create products, it's using that use authenticated fetch hook. And this basically takes care of all the authorization headers and and everything that needs to be added into the request. So super handy, and you'll be using it a lot. And just kind of going over the final files and folders that we haven't looked at. We've got the assets folder, which you can place all your images that your app uses in here. We've got, the package JSON, a couple other random things. Got the README file, another toml config file, the Vite config file for building the front end, and then of course the routes.jsx file, which we did take a look at. All right, so that was an overview of the app structure. There's obviously a lot to unpack here. We didn't go in depth on a lot of this stuff, but my hope is that you walk away from this video a little bit more confident in how the app is structured. Not necessarily how it works underneath the hood yet, but just so that in the coming videos, it'll be easier to figure out which files we're in and where changes need to take place and all that. If you have any questions or there's anything that you really want me to focus on in the next videos, go ahead and put it in the comments down below, or you can DM me on Twitter at devwithalex. There's a lot of exciting stuff coming up in the next few videos. So if you haven't already, please subscribe, hit the bell icon so you get notified the next time I upload. That's all for this video, so I will see you in part 2.